This week, our country celebrated Veterans Day. And Veterans Day, it's one of those days that we stop and we remember and we honor and we thank soldiers, those who have served in the military. And it's kind of a difficult thing, a holiday to have, because soldiers typically don't like gratitude or recognition of any kind. It's just kind of that part of that mindset that recognition and affirmation can actually make soldiers feel uncomfortable, because most soldiers don't go into the military in order to get recognition or affirmation or money. That they usually sign up and they become soldiers for a different reason, a different motivation. It's something different. It's something deeper. I think that was really illustrated this week in the story of Captain Florent Groberg, who was awarded the nation's highest award for soldiers, the Medal of Honor. President Obama gave it to him in the Oval Office. Captain Groberg faced incredible danger, risked his life to save others. While he was out on duty, he identified a person that he knew was a suicide bomber, and he ran at the suicide bomber, grabbed the suicide bomber by the vest, pushed the suicide bomber out of harm's way, away from the people that he could do harm to, and as he threw him to the ground, the bomb exploded and badly injured Captain Groberg. It would take over 30 surgeries and 3 years to save his life and to save his leg and everything that had been damaged. But as Groberg is being given the highest award that be given in the military, just looking at his demeanor, you could tell he is motivated by something else. He didn't pound his chest. He didn't pump his fist in the air. Like, yeah, I did it. Or he didn't even say, yeah, I did it for the army or for the country. But he was very mild-mannered and he was uncomfortable. He felt out of place. He even said he felt a deal of shame at being recognized the way he was. And he dedicated the award to those who had lost their lives in the blast. And he said this, he said, "I am blessed and just grateful to have been given the opportunity to serve my country." Soldiers like Captain Groberg illustrate well Newday's third core value, servant hearts. We've been looking at our identity as a church. We've been discussing what it is that makes us distinct as a church by looking at our core values. And so far that we've seen that we value the Bible and we value prayerful dependence. And I hope that as you've been here and as you've listened to these messages, I hope that you've resonated with these values. If you are a member at Newday, I hope that you've been able to say, yes, that is who we are. We are people of the Word, and we are people so dependent on God that it moves us to pray. And I hope you've been able to identify with that personally as well. Those are things that I value as well. And if you're new to Newday, I hope that you've been able to, as you've listened through the first part of the series, to be able to say, yeah, that does identify this church. I haven't been here long, but I can kind of see these are the things that these people value. They value the Bible and they value prayerful dependence on God, because these are not only things that describe who we believe we are, but these are things that we believe articulate who we want to be. And the same is true for our third core value. It not only describes, I think, who we are, but it also describes who we want to be, who we should be, because we value servant hearts. What does that mean? What's a servant heart? Well, let's read through our core value together out loud. Would you join me? We believe Jesus calls us to follow his example by joyfully and humbly serving one another, as well as those in our community and around the world. We demonstrate our gratitude and obedience by becoming servants who are willing to stoop low and do whatever it takes. That is our value. I think that's a value that was, well articulated in Danielle's story this morning, and it's seen in so many of our stories every day and throughout the week. Now, a distinction I want to make right from the very start is that we value servant hearts, not service. Service is an activity. Service is something that I do, and service is great, and we value service certainly, but that is not our highest value, because I can serve without being a servant. Have you ever been served by somebody who was not a servant? Somebody who would much rather be doing anything else other than serving you at that moment, or someone who was in it for recognition, or in it because they wanted something in return. There were strings attached to their service. You can serve and not be a servant. That's why service is not our highest value, but it's about the heart, servant hearts. While I can serve without being a servant, I can't be a servant without serving. Right? I will serve if I have a servant heart. I will serve with joy and humility. Out of gratitude and obedience, I will stoop low and I will do whatever it takes. That's because being a servant or having a servant's heart is something that I am. It is a part of my identity. That's why several years ago, we made a very intentional and strategic decision to stop using the word volunteer for the people who serve at Newday. Because we're not volunteers, we're servants. And that's a very important distinction. Volunteers serve when they want and how they want. They come on their own terms. They leave on their own terms. Volunteers say, hey, I gave you an hour last month. Where is my plaque? Right? But servants have a very different mindset. A servant says, you know what, I work for something bigger, something higher. I don't come on my own terms. I come on my master's terms. Whatever I need to do, I'm willing to do it. I am invested. This is the mindset of a servant. And people listening from the outside may say, you call people servants? Isn't that kind of demeaning? But no. That is a compliment in our culture. To be called a servant or to have a servant's heart is the highest compliment you can receive. And if you don't get this, you don't get the heart of Jesus. Because you can't read through the New Testament and not clearly see how central servanthood is to who Jesus is. Although he was God in human form, although he had every right to come to earth and order people around and tell everybody what to do, he made it very clear he came as a servant and his role was to serve us. And he did more than just say it. He didn't just give lip service to it. He continually modeled it. He went so far as to wash his followers' feet the night before he would give his life for them in service. And he said that if we want to be like him, we too would be servants. And when you look at those who followed him and those who came after him and those who would lead the church and those who would model what faith looked like, you will see that their main identity, their core identity was the identity of a servant. Look at the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote like half of the New Testament. This was his core identity. He says, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus. This was his favorite self-term. He called himself servant more than anything. The brother of Jesus, James, who wrote a book of the New Testament, also calls himself a servant, where he says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. He understood his identity. The Apostle Peter, someone who at one point did not understand this identity, after the resurrection, after being filled with the Holy Spirit, after seeing the cross, he understood this was his identity as well, because he says, Simon Peter, a servant, an apostle of Christ Jesus. To follow Jesus means that I embrace his identity, and his identity was that of a servant. And so the question I want us all to wrestle with this morning, during the short time we have together, is, am I a servant or do I serve? Is my identity that I have a servant heart, or do I do volunteer work from time to time? And we're all at different places. Some of us don't do volunteer work, some of us do volunteer work, and some of us have servant hearts. We're all on this continuum, all on this journey. The question is, where am I, and am I willing to take the next step? Today we look at a teaching of Jesus that's very quickly going to reveal our hearts on this. It's going to tell us where we are on that continuum personally. It's a short parable Jesus told in Luke chapter 17, and quite frankly, this parable makes me cringe. It's a teaching that I'm a little uncomfortable with. The way, even though it's Jesus, I'm like, ooh, did you have to say it like that? Because not only does it get at the heart of our core value, but it reveals our heart and tells us, by the reaction in your heart when I read this parable, listen to what's happening inside of you, because it's going to tell you where you are with this value. Luke chapter 17, beginning in verse 7. This is Jesus teaching. He's talking to his disciples, and he says this: suppose one of you had a servant plowing or looking after the sheep. What do you say to the servant when he comes in from the field? Come along now and sit down to eat. Now, if we're answering that question in our culture, we may say, well, of course we would. We want to be considerate. Jesus is implying he probably wouldn't. Would he not rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready, and wait on me while I eat and drink? After that, you may eat and drink. Would he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. You too should say, we are only unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Wow. How do you react to that passage? Don't have to answer out loud. Just personally, how do you react to that? Does it rub you wrong? Is it a bit abrasive? Do you find it that Jesus is being insensitive maybe in this teaching? And I still remember the first time I read this passage and really got what Jesus was saying, and it just hit me in the heart because it was so convicting, because I realized it was exposing something in me that realized I had a lot of room to grow personally. I mean, what a counterculture message. Let's just unpack what Jesus is saying and what it means to be a servant and to have a servant heart. And I think by the time we're done here, we're going to kind of have an understanding of what Jesus is saying and why he's saying it. First, consider the word that Jesus uses here when he talks about servant. It's one of the most common words in the New Testament in the Greek. It's used almost as much as the word and. But it's the word doulos, which is the word for bondservant. That's the original meaning of this word, is bondservant, slave servant or bondservant. Now, a bondservant is someone who would willingly and voluntarily sell themselves into slavery. Now, you may wonder, why in the world would someone sell themselves into slavery? But this was very common in Jesus' day, that someone would work up such a debt that they wouldn't be able to pay it off on their own. Therefore, they would sell themselves to a master who would then pay off their debt, and then they would work for that master for as long as it would take to pay off that debt, whether 5 years or 10 years or the rest of their lives. And so this was something that people would enter into voluntarily to have their debt paid off. And Jesus is referring to something that is as common in his culture as fast food is in our culture. Bondservants, slaves, servants, they were everywhere. It's estimated that at the time that Jesus was saying this and that Jesus lived, that 2/3 of the Roman Empire was made up of servants and slaves and bondservants. Matter of fact, the story is told that the Roman council got together because slaves and free people would all dress the same. You couldn't really tell the difference between a slave and a free person. They wanted to maybe change that. And so they said, why don't we have slaves dressed differently? We could put them in like a slave uniform so we could identify the slaves for the free people. But then they realized if that happened, that the slaves would see how greatly they outnumber the free people, that they would revolt and take over the empire. So they threw that idea away. This is how common slavery was in the empire. Again, most entered into it voluntarily, but slavery is a tough topic for us because of our history with slavery, because of our battle with the civil rights, because of our view of slavery. And while slavery was very different in Jesus' time, I'm confident that Jesus is not endorsing slavery through this teaching, but rather he's using it as a metaphor of how we, as his followers, are to relate with him, our master. And the point of what Jesus is making is that the slave or the servant relates with his master in a particular way. And the first thing we see from this parable is that a slave or a servant does whatever it takes. And whatever it takes isn't always easy. The example he uses is like, let's say someone is out there like plowing the field all day, or maybe they're taking care of the sheep. They're going to do whatever it takes because that's what a servant does. When they come in, are they going to like get to kick back because they've plowed a little bit or taken care of the sheep? No, because the servant does whatever it takes, and there's still something that's needed. The master needs to be fed, and so now that servant, because he does whatever it takes, he's going to cook for the master. See, the servant doesn't have just one role. I'm the plow guy, or I'm the shepherd, or I'm the cook. No. A servant does whatever it takes. Whatever needs to be done, I'm willing to do it. If I see a need, I will meet that need. Now, there are some very real implications to this teaching of Jesus and to this truth. Because a servant is willing to do whatever it takes, that means a servant's job is really never done. I never step out of my role of being a servant. It means when I wake up in the morning, because I am a servant, I do whatever it takes, I serve the needs of my family or whoever it is that's in my house. That when I go to work or I go to school, that I serve my teachers and my classmates, or I serve my boss and my coworkers, I serve my clients. I do whatever it takes. When I go back home, I am still a servant. There are still things that need to be done. Therefore, I serve the needs of the people in my family. And you're thinking to yourself, what, do I have to do everything? Well, if everyone gets this mindset, it's really a beautiful thing, right? We're all serving one another. When I am out in the community, I'm serving, I'm looking for needs. What needs can I meet? I'm a servant. I don't step out of the role. When I come to church, I'm serving. I'm a servant. That's who I am. It's not just a church thing. This is an all-the-time thing. We never stop being servants because there's always something more that needs to be done, and we're willing to do whatever it takes. Another implication of doing whatever it takes is that a servant's job isn't always glamorous. That means that no matter how many degrees I have or how important I am or how much money I have or what kind of car I drive, it means that sometimes I may find myself doing things that at one point I thought were below me. And this is one of the, I think, identifying marks that identifies a servant heart more than anything. Someone who is willing to stoop low and do whatever it takes, regardless of who they are. And I see this time and time again in Newday people. Just this morning, I loved watching Roger Beckner, an engineer, work so hard just to make sure every row was perfectly straight. I was just watching him. He's like bumping this chair just a centimeter and moving that one over. He's doing whatever it takes. It's not too low for him because he realizes that he is a servant. Or let me embarrass somebody because they're not here today. They're gone with all the parents, I think, to Life Source. But Sam and Melissa Hunegart are new Newday members. They recently moved here from San Marcos, Texas, with their kids, Chloe and Christian. And Sam came to Parker to fill the very big shoes of Maury Dean as the CEO at Parker Adventist Hospital. And so in Sam's context, he is the boss, right? He's got some 1,000 employees working for him. But about 2 weeks ago, I was standing out in the foyer, and I just happened to notice Sam do something. He walked by a piece of trash, and then he noticed it. And without realizing that I was watching or anyone else was watching, he kind of turned around, he walked back. It was kind of blowing away, but he picked it up, and then he went and he threw it away. Now, you may think, well, that's no big deal. So some guy picked up a piece of trash. But what that does is it identifies a servant heart. It's someone who identifies a need, sees something that needs to be done, and they don't wait for someone else to do it. They don't say, well, that's not my job, it's not my role, someone else's job, they'll do it. Or, I'm a CEO, that's beneath me, I don't pick up trash. No, a servant sees what needs to be done. They understand this is my identity, I'm a servant, I'm going to do whatever it takes. It's a servant heart. A second important point from this parable is that a servant serves the needs of the master before their own needs. Before the servant eats his meal and relaxes, he fixes a meal for his master and makes sure he has everything he needs. Then, after the master is satisfied, he's able to fix his own meal. And so as servants of Jesus, we learn what Jesus' interests are. What does he care about? And then we serve those needs before our own needs. So many Christians today, followers of Jesus, say, I'd give more of myself to God. I would serve more, but I'm just so busy. My needs before his needs. Or I want to do more for God, but I just have some things I need to get done. I want to acquire more or accomplish more, but then once I get to the stage of life, then I'm going to give more of myself to God. My needs before his needs. See, the servant, Jesus would, that's like the servant coming in and fixing his meal first and taking a break and then fixing the meal for his master. And Jesus would say, that is unthinkable. That does not work in our economy. That does not work with our values. What this means is that being a servant and having a servant's heart means sometimes it's going to cost me something. Sometimes it's going to cost me things that I value. Maybe sometimes it's going to cost me my freedom to do what I want when I want it. Let me just assure you that the point of this message is not to get you to sign up for some kind of a ministry. We're not going to have an appeal at the end. That's not what this is about. Hey, we have volunteer roles that need to be filled. We're not going there today. So rest, easy. But sometimes in order to embrace biblical values, we have to identify the counter values that are keeping us from living those biblical values, because that is always happening. All of our values that we want to live by, there are counter values trying to pull us away. And we have a counter value working against this value of servant heart. And that value is this idea in our culture of personal freedom, of consumerism, of an unwillingness to commit because I have the freedom to not have to commit. We in our culture have so many options of things that we can do with our time. We live in this affluent culture. So many options available to us that many of us are unwilling to commit to serve on a regular basis at Newday or anywhere else. So we wonder to ourselves, well, why would I, with all of the things that I could do with these 3 hours on Saturday morning, why would I lock myself into just one thing, even if it's just once a month? Why would I commit? I mean, what if I want to do something else on that time that I'm committed to do something? I mean, what if another opportunity arises? I value freedom or my ability to choose what I want when I want it. I like having the freedom to not have to commit. Now, this is a cultural value. We have to, that's part of who we are. And it's actually a value at Newday that kind of is underlying that servant heart value. It's one of those counter values that's always trying to it's kind of under the surface. It's a value, but it's not a biblical value. It's a person with a servant's heart puts their master's interest before their own. One of the reasons we read this parable and we just have the reaction that we do and we're shocked is because of our cultural values of consumerism. We wonder, why would our own needs not always rise to the top in every situation? Why would I not always be thanked for anything I do for anybody? How can Jesus ask for such dedication? It's because his values and our values are different values. His values are very counterculture. A third point Jesus makes in this parable about servants is that a servant doesn't do what he does expecting to be thanked. This is a hard one. I've read enough about leadership and motivating people and influencing people to know that people need affirmation and encouragement, right? I need affirmation and encouragement. But Jesus asks, when he speaks of the master, he says, would he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? And the implied answer is no, he would not thank the servant. Let's be clear. Jesus is not saying that we shouldn't thank one another when we serve one another. That is not what Jesus is saying, nor is he saying that our service to him is meaningless or useless. We see lots of examples of encouragement and affirmation in the Bible. Jesus himself says, for those who serve faithfully, when we meet him in heaven, he's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant, right? So he's not saying we shouldn't thank one another. What he is doing is warning against an attitude of entitlement. We are not entitled to anything. We are not entitled to gratitude. He's reminding us of the relationship between the servant and the master. It's not about us, it's about him. See, when we give ourselves to service, it's easy to think that God somehow owes me something. That I'm entitled to God because of what I've just done for him. Lord, don't you know that last month I gave an hour to the kids' Sabbath school division? How could you let this happen to me? Or don't you know how I serve on the worship team once a month? Or how I'm on God's squad and I'm making the rows so straight and I'm setting up the chairs and I'm carrying in bins? God, you owe me something. But we can never serve so much or so well that we put the master ever in a position of indebtedness to us. We serve him because of all we owe him. We serve him because of all he has done to serve us. A servant doesn't work to be thanked. A servant works in order to say thank you. This servant here had all of his debt paid off by his master. That is thanks enough for him. Or think of it this way. Our service doesn't put us in favor with God because we are already in favor with God. Right? So we can't do anything to earn more of that favor because we already have all of God's favor at our disposal. And we need to be careful when we start expecting God to give us something in return because we're asking God to start to relate to us in a way that would be fair, and that's the last thing we want. We don't want fairness from God. We want grace from God. One commentator, Culpepper, he writes it like this. He says, very well, he says, God owes us nothing for living good Christian lives. God's favor and blessing are matters of grace. They cannot be earned. Therefore, when we assume that we could deal with God on the basis of what God owes us, we have made a basic mistake. We have rejected grace as the basis of our relationship to God and based that relationship on our own worth and merit. You don't want to go there. Grace, by definition, is a free gift. So the bottom line is, when we live in grace, we already have all of God's resources at our disposal. We have all of his favor shining on us, so we can't expect anything more than that. So the point, after everything the servant has done to serve their master, they don't deserve any commendation. They don't receive a plaque or deserve a plaque or a pat on the back or an attaboy. Why? Because we've already received something far greater than thank you. We've received life. Life at the expense of Christ's life. He's served us by giving us his all. Our sins have been forgiven. Our eternity is secure. We serve so that we can say thank you to him. I mean, have you ever been so grateful to somebody? If someone did something for you or gave you something or said something to you, that you were so grateful that you send them a thank you note or a thank you gift. Anyone ever do that? Have you ever had someone send you a thank you gift for your thank you gift? That just is maddening. Stop that. Don't do that. I'm trying to say thank you to you, so you stop saying thank you to me for saying thank you to you. That just kind of nullifies everything. I'm trying to bless you, so stop trying to bless me. And it's the same way for a servant. My service is my thank you. So please don't say thank you for my thank you to you. So hopefully this is starting to make a little sense. I don't know. But with this in mind, verse 10 starts to make a little bit more sense. So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We've only done our duty. In the context of the Greek and also the context of the parable, to be unworthy means to be unworthy of praise. We are unworthy of praise, Lord. Please don't say thank you to me. We've only done our duty. And this really gets at the heart of our value. I mean, the key words that we use in our value statement, like joyful and humble and stoop low and do whatever it takes, are all right here represented in this one sentence that Jesus speaks. I mean, when you've done what you've been told to do, when you have worked hard all day out in the field plowing or taking care of the sheep, and you've come in and you've cooked a meal for the master, and when you are tired and you have gone above and beyond the call of duty, you should still say, I don't deserve any kind of praise. I don't deserve a plaque. I don't deserve a pat on the back. I have only done my duty. I have only done this much to begin to repay all that you've done for me. Does this describe your heart? Lauren Sani was the founder of Navigators, and he was once asked, how can you tell if you really have a servant heart? And he put it so succinctly, but so profoundly. He says, you know you're a servant by how you act when you're treated like one. When you're treated like a servant, do you get offended? Or when someone forgets to say thank you, do you just kind of fall to pieces? I mean, it's relatively easy to serve someone who is thankful and friendly and lovable. But when someone treats you like a servant, when someone expects you to do what you're doing, when they treat you as lower than they are and they look down their nose at you, and you find your back kind of stiffening a little bit, you know your heart still has some room for growth. And let me assure you, my heart still has lots of room for growth. And if you're suspicious that your heart still has lots of room for growth and that you're not at that place that Jesus is talking about, then it's all the more reason to thank God that you're living under grace. But you may think to yourself, but I want this heart. I read this, I want that attitude. I want a servant heart. How do I get it? And most of us have lived long enough to realize we can't just willpower our way to it, or we can't just snap our fingers and change our heart where all of a sudden we're gracious all the time and do whatever it takes and put our master's interest first. But that it has to be a work of the Spirit. That it has to be one of those things that we are prayerfully dependent about, right? When we read that passage and we realize how far we have to go, that we would just get on our face before God and say, God, give me this heart, change my hard heart. And really it has to come out of a heart of gratitude, a heart that understands what Christ did and the depth of the price that he paid to buy us back from death. I mean, when I begin to get a sense of how much Jesus gave to save me personally, when I begin to get a sense of how much God loves me personally, then a servant's heart is the only response that makes sense. I've told the story before. One of my favorite movie scenes is from the movie The Count of Monte Cristo. It's a great movie. You haven't seen it yet. You have to see this movie. But Edmond Dantes was betrayed by his best friend and sent away to life in the most difficult prison. He was going to be there for life, but he miraculously escapes. And he finds himself washed ashore in front of a band of these dangerous pirates. And they were there because they were going to bury alive one of their own, Jacopo, who had stole some of the bounty for himself. And so he was going to be buried alive, but the captain doesn't want to bury him alive because he's such a great pirate. And he wants to save him. But then he sees Edmond Dantes, and he devises a plan. And he says, you two, Jacopo and Edmond, you're going to fight to the death with knives. And whoever lives is free, because he figured, well, Jacopo will probably kill this guy Edmund, no problem, and then I can let him off without appearing too lenient. But if this guy Edmund kills Jacopo, well, then Jacopo dies, but not on my hand, and I still look like a good captain. And so they go out and the fight begins, and the recently escaped Edmund quickly gains the upper hand, and he pins Jacopo, and he strips him of his knife, and there's the knife over him, but of course he refuses to kill him. He spares Jacopo's life, and there with the knife over Jacopo, he convinces the captain, take both of us, you'll get 2 loyal pirates where before you had one. And the captain thinks about it, and he says, okay, that's great. So they get up from this knife fight, and that's when Jacopo grabs Edmund by the neck, and he pulls him close by the neck. And he says to him, I swear on all my dead relatives, and even those who aren't feeling too well, that I am forever your man. That I am forever your man. You spared my life. You've given me my life back. I am forever your man. And those were more than words, because for the rest of Edmond Dantes' life, Jacopo was his man, and he served him selflessly. He did whatever it takes. He put his master's interests before his own. And are we not in even a better situation than Jacopo? Jesus didn't just spare our lives. He served us to the death. He lived a perfect life, and then he willingly carried my sin up a hill, was nailed to a cross. The eternal God, the one who had never had a beginning, now had his very first end. He died a death he didn't deserve to die, so that you can live a life that you didn't deserve to live. And then he, a few days later, conquered the grave. He lives now forever, and he promises me now, and he promises you that if you'll only trust him, if you'll only surrender the rest of your life to him, that you'll live forever with him. I mean, how can I not give my all? How can I not give my best for someone who loves me that well and has given so much to save me? I would say I am forever your man. And just listen, anything less than a servant's heart is either failure to grasp what he's done, or it is intentional ingratitude for the greatest gift that has ever been given. That's why we value what we value. It's not what we do, it's who we are. We're servants.